So I think it is quite obvious that fear, panic, and anxiety are really kind of taking hold over all human beings, regardless of race, regardless of religion, ethnicity, and all of these kind of identity categories. Really, these three elements, fear, panic, and anxiety, are bringing our common humanity down, if I could put it bluntly. And these three emotions of fear, panic, and anxiety are escalating our insecurities. And they're really lowering our spiritual immune systems. These three issues, fear, panic, and anxiety, are really the opposite kind of medicine, if I could put it that way, that we need to overcome the COVID-19 pandemic. And they're very kind of doom and gloom emotions, fear, panic, and anxiety. And they're also highly contagious, if I could put it that way. And yet I believe, as I'm sure many of you who are tuning in would agree, that there must be some type of higher kind of learning that God and the universe is trying to teach us during this time of a pandemic. And I'm going to pose it here that this higher kind of learning has to do with four interrelated elements. And these interrelated elements are compassion, faith, fear, and I'm going to place an emphasis on the latter of love. And I want to shed light on these four interrelated components by actually turning to chapter 14 of the book of Matthew, which is in the New Testament. And I really do think these two stories that I'm going to provide really help us relate to the unpleasant and the challenging situations that so many of us are now in. And while I'm a Christian myself, and these stories are obviously coming from the Christian tradition, you don't have to kind of let these stories and the higher meaning of these stories sink into your heart, your mind, and your soul. So the first story unfolds something like this. King Herod had just beheaded John the Baptist. And for those who are familiar with this story, John the Baptist was the cousin of Jesus. And some of John's followers went to Jesus and told him, your cousin has been murdered by King Herod. And Jesus was upset with what he had heard. So he withdrew in a boat privately and Jesus to a solitary place. And a lot of scholars suggest that this solitary space was Bethsaida, an ancient town. And when Jesus touched the ground again, he realized that he was not alone because some of the people were following him. He was rowing close to land and followers were following to see where he was going to place his boat. And when Jesus got off the boat, he realized that there was a huge crowd of people in front of him. But his heart, when seeing this group of people, was filled with sorrow because many of these people were destitute. They were sick, they were hungry, and they were generally in need of a helping hand. In the evening time of that same day, Jesus's disciples came to him in one quote, "It is very late, and this is a lonely place. Send the people away and let them go to the villages to buy food for themselves." In other words, the disciples did not want to be bothered by those people who were in need. The disciples wanted these people to fend for themselves amidst the challenges that they were facing. And to be clear, the disciples were not being mean to these people, but they were certainly being indifferent. They didn't know what it meant to truly love one's neighbor as they would love themselves. They did not understand compassion. The hunger and the sickness that they saw around them was none of their business, and they approached it that way, and they were fine with it. By all means, the disciples were self-absorbed and they were self-concerned. And if you can imagine Jesus watching the disciples behave this way, he must have been somewhat frustrated with their mindset and their behavior. How could they be so cold amidst the suffering? How could they be so selfish? How could they be so inhumane in the face of suffering? And their behavior begs the question, how did Jesus respond? In defiance of his disciples, Jesus said the following: "These people don't have to leave. You yourselves give them something to eat." And looking around, the disciples were obviously really confused. They were told by Jesus to feed the hungry, but there was hardly any food around, except for 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. They also wondered, how can we feed so many people with such little food? This is what the disciples wondered. And to kind of capture this, Jesus told the disciples, bring all of these hungry people, these destitute and sick people to me, in front of me. Jesus took the food, he offered a prayer to God, and then all of a sudden a miracle happened. All the food multiplied many times over, and the Bible tells us that a miracle was performed. And it is important here to remember that when the people were fed, it was not Jesus who literally fed them. It was the disciples who fed them. And he wanted them to feed the people because Jesus wanted to teach his followers about compassion. He wanted the hearts of the disciples to be on fire when they saw people in need. Jesus did not want them ever to be indifferent to suffering. That is because love, which is what he was teaching, does not tolerate indifference. Love does not tolerate indifference. The disciples themselves, they indeed did get their hands dirty, as Jesus wanted them to. They ended up having to get uncomfortable by serving the people. And one can surmise that the disciples refused to initially help the needy people for several reasons. Perhaps they just wanted to move on from that lonely place. Maybe they had other plans of bringing Jesus to another town, to another group of people. But I actually think there is another factor behind the indifference of the disciples during this interaction they had with the destitute people. And that factor is fear. Fear, as I often explain to my students, can mean several things, and I'm going to refer to these through the use of an acronym. Fear could mean forget everything and run, FEAR, forget everything and run. Fear could also mean false evidence appearing real. But I like to give my students something much more engaging and constructive. Face everything and rise. Face everything and rise. In the context of Jesus, he knew his disciples wanted to turn their backs on the needy people. He knew that they were afraid of strangers, of getting their hands dirty, of helping the destitute, the hungry, and the sick. So Jesus taught them to have courage. And to have courage, one needs to have love and vice versa. This relationship between love, courage, and faith, which I'm really bringing to the forefront here, also relates to the next story that we see in Matthew chapter 14. And this story unfolds in the following manner. Jesus told his disciples, get in the boat, and I want you to row to the other side of the sea, and I will see you later. And while they were leaving, Jesus interacted a bit more with the needy people. Eventually, he told them to go on your way, and Jesus went into isolation again. And you can imagine, again, he was probably thinking of the lack of compassion, the lack of courage that his disciples were displaying in front of the hungry people. So he decides to pray. And by this time, the boat that the disciples were on were far out on the lake. There was rocky waves and there was high winds, and the high winds had pushed them out into sea. And the disciples spend the night on the boat in the darkness. And you can imagine how they may feel. They had no food. They probably had no blankets. It could have been cold. It was pitch. This was not with them. But in the early hours of the morning, as Matthew 14 tells us, Jesus came to the boat walking on water. He was engaging in another miracle. And as you can imagine, the disciples were terrified at what they were witnessing. They thought there was a ghost coming on board their boat. And when Jesus got to the boat, he said something that was really powerful, especially in light of our current pandemic situation. And he said, courage. It is I, don't be afraid. Courage. And one of the disciples, Peter, was not so sure it was really Jesus that was now at the boat. And at that very moment, Peter was filled with disbelief, and he said to Jesus, Lord, if it is really you, order me to come out on the water to you. So Jesus just said, come. So Peter gets out of the boat. Peter starts walking on water towards Jesus. But when Peter noticed that a high wind started coming, he became afraid. And when that fear came inside of Peter, he started not walking on water anymore. He started sinking. So Peter cries out, save me, Jesus, to which Jesus grabbed him and responded, what little faith you have. Why did you doubt? So the issue here in the main point is that it was fear that was sinking Peter. When Peter had faith, he was walking on water. When he had fear, he sank in the water. The same is true for us right now. No matter what religious background, racial background, ethnicity, or any type of identity category. Fear in a pandemic will sink us. It will sink our common humanity. And let me be clear here, and this is an important point. I'm not suggesting that we should not fear the virus. Some people do not fear catching it, which is reckless and dangerous because it puts our fellow human beings in potential harm's way. I'm instead referring to the fear of helping others, the fear of making difficult sacrifices, and the fear that things will never be the same. The daily rising death tolls, the closures, the tanking stock markets, the shutdown of travel, the threats to globalization, these things rightly scare us. They can devastate us, and they can cause us to lose faith in God's love for us all and, of course, our common humanity. But where love reigns, fear has no place, because love and fear do not mix, and love and fear will not mix. So let me end by going back to where we started. On the higher level of learning, God and the universe is trying to teach us during this time of a pandemic. And perhaps this is a test to see how much we as human beings are able to really love one another, to open our hearts to feel the pain of others, to stand with those who are facing difficulty in their hour of need, and to even be comfortable with being uncomfortable and alone if it means saving lives and preventing the spread of the COVID-19 disease. For it is by loving one another that we love God. And I'll end with chapter 4, verse 7 of the book of John, as it reminds us, we are from God. Let us love one another because love comes from God. Everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love. Let us love one another and let us choose love over fear, not only in a time of a pandemic, but always. Thank you so much.